We don't know the ways of God. We marinate in the world's ways. We know the world's ways. That comes instinctively to us because we've been immersed in it all of our life. But you have to learn the ways of God, and they're counterintuitive.
Welcome to the Faith Forward Leadership Podcast, where we talk with leaders about how they cultivate a higher purpose in their companies today and perpetuate it beyond their tenure. I am delighted today to have Dr. Richard Blackaby with us, the president of Blackaby Ministries. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's always a privilege talking to you, Becca.
Well, like millions of other people around the world, my husband and I have been so moved by the work of Blackaby Ministries. In fact, early in our marriage, I'll share this artifact, our Experiencing God workbook, which is a well-worn, for those of you watching,
that's
workbook
good.
we went through. We loved it so much, we bought 12 copies and gave them to all of our friends, which I don't know that we've done with any other book. So just so grateful. It's been so impactful in our lives. And it's one of those things I like to go back to and look through, especially when I'm struggling with, how can I improve in abiding? And Lord, what does that look like? I know a lot of people listening and watching will be familiar with your ministry, with your books. But one thing they may not know is about the extensive discipleship work that you do with business leaders, in particular, those leading very large public and private organizations. And actually, you and I first met in person through a YPO event.
Yeah.
Where you were talking to these leaders and ministering at that event. And I'd love for people to get a little window into that side of the ministry work and world that you serve. So share with us a little bit, how did you get into discipling business leaders, and what has that been like?
Yeah, well, my dad was a pastor and thought that that's what he would always do, and that's what his training was. And then God just drifted him more and more into the business community. Some high-level business people just came to him and said, "Henry, no one has ever discipled us." Sometimes when you own or run the biggest company in town, your pastor feels threatened by you, or they just assume that if you're that good at business, you must be good at being a Christian, and so on. And so nobody, the pastors, the staff, other people just felt like, what can we, what can we do to help him? And so they just said, but I don't know how to pray. I don't know how to know God's will. And so my dad was brought in and helped to start a ministry that works with CEOs, and that I've been very much involved with for the last 20 years. And but I know even just when I started out as a pastor, I just kind of did the traditional things. I was geared up for the weekends and the services, and working on my sermons all week. And I remember I used to always be depressed on Monday morning because I had to wait a whole week until I got all my people back in the building with me. And I remember one day just God really kind of challenging me and saying, like, your people don't just cease to exist all week until Sunday. The height of their week and their involvement, their work is going on all week long while you're sitting at the church building wishing that it was Sunday again. And so so God really impacted me by that. And so I actually started reaching out to some of the business folks. And I remember the first guy that I reached out to, he was a great guy, became a good friend of mine. But I knew he worked at a business downtown somewhere, but I didn't know anything really about his company. And I just said, "Hey, could I ever just stop by and go for lunch with you? I'd love just to see where you work and find out what you do." And oh yeah, that'd be great. So we set up a time. I go down there, and I don't realize, like, he's the number two guy. Like, there's the owner, and then there's him, and he runs everything. And they bring me in, and it's a booming business. But they bring me back into his office. It's this at that time I'd never been in an office so big. You could have a whole ballroom dance in his office, but he looks quite discouraged. And I asked what was going on, and they had just lost a major contract. And he said, "I've got to lay off about a dozen to 24 people." And he had all these personnel files on his desk. He said, "I'm trying to decide which people we let go." And it was just tearing him up. He said they all have mortgages, they've got families, and it's up to me to have to make these calls, and I remember just looking at him and thinking, I each week I'm getting up and putting sermons out there, but I have no idea what these guys are facing during the week, like what they need, and so it totally revolutionized the way I pastored. I began to say, "Well, what are you facing? Like, what are the issues? What are the stresses and the pressures?" He had a very demanding owner that, would do anything for a sale, and so my church member at times felt a lot of pressure to compromise some things, some values, and he didn't wanna look like he was disloyal, but he also didn't wanna compromise some stances that he had made and was committed to, and it completely changed the way I viewed, the business people in my church, and so just over time, I was kinda pulled in, with my dad and his ministry, and so now probably about half my time I work with church leaders and half my time with business leaders, and I love working with business leaders because, of course, they're smart, they're great leaders, they're entrepreneurial, they're creative, really some of the most gifted, talented people in the kingdom of God work in the marketplace, but the kingdom of God a lot of times has never leveraged all this massive skill and creativity and problem-solving ability because all we think in terms of just what happens in a church building. It's been really fun for me to just walk alongside these business leaders and say, "Why did God put you in this company in the first place? Why did he give you 100,000 employees? Why did he give you over $1 billion to administer every year? Do you think God had a plan for that, an intention for that? Is there a way you can manage that that brings glory to God?" And so that's a lot of fun doing that kind of stuff.
That's amazing to see how God just led you on the journey and your dad too as a pastor, truly understanding those you serve and seeing that, church that Sunday, Monday disconnect between the church and the business world and how to effectively kind of help bridge that gap to help encourage folks to take their faith and let that how my God call them to let their faith influence their work.
Yeah, and my dad, if you've ever taken I know you've taken Experiencing God as you showed me, but one of the main principles there was that God's always at work around you, and when God shows you what he's up to, you need to join him. You need to make a beeline for where you saw God at work, and my dad just very early on saw that God was working in the marketplace, and so he just made a beeline to be a part of that, and when people would ask him, "Where do you see God at work in the world today?" That was usually his first response was in the marketplace. That's where the action is. All we not the he would say, the weekend church services are the equipping, but the work, the real mission is taking place all week long in the workplace.
Right, and I've, heard that quote that, like, pastors get people, an hour or 2 a week, but leaders and managers, you have people run, upwards of 40 hours a week, and there's a huge ministry opportunity if you can take that and,
Yeah.
appropriately reflect it there.
Yeah, and a lot of those people don't go to church on the weekend, so the church gets 0 hours with them, but you as the
Right.
manager, you get 40 hours or more with people that the pastor never sees, and so, yeah, the responsibility there, the stewardship of that, and that's one of the things a lot of folks have realized as I walk with them is this: I am a steward of everything God's put at my disposal, so whatever platform I have, whatever influence, and they realize it's not just my employee, but it's the employee's spouse, the employee's kids. When
Mhm.
I start to think of all the people who are impacted, because of my influence and my leadership in this company, it begins to become very sobering to realize, "Boy, I need to be more thoughtful, more intentional about my influence that God's given me."
Mm. Yeah, and each person, I mean, everyone listening, we all have a sphere of influence. It might look a little different than yours leading this
Yeah,
ministry, but we all have that sphere of influence. It's such a good reminder in our communities, in our families, in our workplaces.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, and if it's just I was, had an Ubered, ride recently, and I was asking this young man, did he plan to, always be an Uber driver? Did he have other aspirations? And he was like, "Yeah, I'd love to be a CEO one day." I said, "Oh, that's great to shoot for. How's that going?" And well, it seemed like a long ways away, but I said, but this is the way I view it. I said, you are a CEO now. You're a CEO of you. I said, you have to manage your budget, your calendar, your relationships, your opportunities. I said, you have to maintain your vehicle, your house, your food, like your entertainment. I said, like, you have a lot of things to administer just for you. I said, and I said, I found that with God, if you're faithful with a little, if you can manage yourself well, then God may entrust you with some more people. And I said, if you can't even handle your own life well, I don't know any business owner who'd want you to manage their company if you can't handle you well. So I said, so you just be a really good CEO of you today, and that growing influence can happen over time.
Absolutely. Well, years back when I was writing Lead on Mission with this target of serving business leaders, how to integrate faith in the workplace and nonprofit leaders too. How do we effectively reflect faith in the workplace? I was in deep in the writing process and I kept thinking of who I'm going to ask to write the foreword for this book. And you kept coming to mind because, obviously, because the influence of experiencing God and all the great books you've written, but also this awareness of how to serve business leaders and awareness of the challenges and this constant theme that I see in your work about abiding, which also became obvious the more I started working with leaders on how do we avoid mission drift. We can define, we can protect and champion, but what's missing here and how do we know how to do that? It's really through abiding. So I wanted to read an excerpt you wrote uh, from the book, Lead on Mission,
Oh, yeah.
that I thought was really helpful and relates to what you were just sharing. It said, you wrote, each one of us will eventually transition out of leadership, yet the way in which we lead today can impact people's lives for eternity. Do not spend so much time and effort on what the world claims is important that you neglect God's purpose for you and your company. Lead in such a way that your godly, wise influence continues long after you're gone. Learn to do business God's way. So I love that quote and wanted to give you some space to share how have you seen that? What does that look like to learn to do business God's way and doing business God's way? How do we even get started on that journey?
Yeah, I wrote a book about 2 years ago called The Ways of God, and I just realized, that God says in Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, "Your ways are not my ways. Your thoughts are not my thoughts." And that's a hard thing for a lot of us to realize. We assume because we're Christians that we just think the way God does, but God says, "No, absolutely not." My dad used to say if he had a plan that made perfect sense to him, that he was pretty certain it hadn't come from God because because God's ways just aren't the same as his ways. And so the problem a lot of times is that with God, what you do is really important, but how you do it is just as important. And I've seen a lot of well-intentioned people who did the right thing, they just did it the wrong way, and then they wondered why God didn't bless. Certainly, that's true in business, where people felt led by God to start a company. Perhaps their product was going to address a need in their community, and they did what God said. They started a company, but then God didn't bless, and it wasn't very successful, and they'd be bewildered. And sometimes, as I've walked with them, it's become clear that they didn't do it. They once they knew what to do, they charged off to do it. And God's like, wait, I didn't tell you how to do it yet. There's a way to do it that you can do the same thing in more than one way, but God wants you to do it in the way that glorifies Him, that accomplishes His purposes, that builds His kingdom, and not just that makes you the most money necessarily, or that magnifies your name the most, but that magnifies His. So a couple things I would just say with that. One is the reason I wrote that book was we don't know the ways of God. We marinate in the world's ways, we know the world's ways way. That comes instinctively to us because we've been immersed in it all of our life. But you have to learn the ways of God, and they're counterintuitive. You know, when God says the last will be first, that's not the way we've been taught. That the servant is greater than the master. That's no, that's we don't believe that because we've marinated in the world all. If you save your life, you'll lose it. Well, that's not what the world says. So, you God's going to have to teach you, is it possible to do business his way? Because at times it'll seem ludicrous, it'll seem crazy. But if you want God's blessing, if you want to glorify God with your work, you're going to have to do it his way. And you're going to have to do that, you have to know what his ways are. But you talked about abiding too. And you know, when I've discipled high level business executives, usually one of the first things that we address is abiding. And it's always funny to watch that because you're going to get like CEOs of Fortune 500 companies that are used to making things happen. They speak a word and stuff gets into motion, and they make quick decisions, and they're decisive, and they want action. They're people of action. And abiding is all about a relationship. And as a Christian, it's not a belief system. Christianity is not a belief system. It's a relationship. It's a relationship with a person. And like
Mm.
any relationship, you have to invest time. And abiding means resting in God, remaining in God, dwelling in God. Abiding is slowing down. And for these CEOs in particular, type A driven people, one of the things I found that is so revolutionary is just the concept of just slowing down and just staying with God, because it will drive them crazy. They'll they'll tell you they're too busy to do that. You know, famously, my dad one time was meeting with a very high level CEO, a group of the group that my dad and I have worked with for a long time, and this one he was talking about abiding in Christ. Just slow down, stop talking, start listening. Or I don't care how big your company is, it's not as big as God's organization. So just you chill out and listen to him. And this guy said, "Well, Henry, the problem is you don't know how busy we are. It's easy to, you can tell pastors abide in Christ. You got all week to do nothing but abide." But he said, "But we run big companies. We're very busy people." And my dad looked at this man and said, "No," he said, "your problem is you don't know who you're going to be meeting with. Because if you had any idea the magnitude of a meeting with God, you'd have the time." He said, "Your
Wow.
problem is you don't know God like you ought to." And that really shut the guy down. And so they met a couple months later. And the guy said, "Hey, you guys remember that conversation I had with Henry last time?" He said, "I got to tell you," he said, "I went home and I was so convicted by that I finally just began to pray and say, God, what would it look like for me to abide in you?" And he said, "It means I gotta spend more time with him, but as soon as I get to the office, it's just I'm swept up." So he said, "I realize I'm gonna have to meet with him early in the morning," and so he said, "I kept trying to figure out how early do I need to get up, because my dad would say, 'You need to spend unhurried time with God.' So not a
Mm.
quick 15 minutes where you keep looking at your watch like, 'I gotta get out of here in the next 2 minutes or I'm gonna be hitting traffic this morning commuting to work.'" But he said, "You get up so early that you've got all the time in the world to give to God." And he said, for this guy, it ended up being 4 in the morning. He said, "If I got up at 4, I could get showered and get my coffee, and then I could sit with God and have plenty of time." And he said, "But I didn't think I could ever afford to do that." But he said 2 things. He said, one is, he said, "It's amazing to me how when I meet with God and just listen to him, it's like God knows exactly what I'm going to face that day. He prepares me, he gives me insights, he helps me know what matters. And then sure enough, all day long, everything God prepared me for, I'm just nailing it all day long." But he said the other thing is, he said, since we last met, he said, and since I started doing this, I actually led my first employee to faith in Christ. He said, I had no idea what God could do once I just got aligned with him. And so It's fun watching these high-level business guys learning how to abide in Christ and to slow down and to listen and to let him set the agenda. This guy said business has never been better. It's not like it's gonna harm your business for you to be walking in sync with God. It's just the opposite. Now
Mm,
you're nailing everything that really matters. Now that you're God's helping guide you to avoid some pitfalls and avoid making some bad decisions and to understand what the truth is of your situation. And he said it's been the best thing I've ever done. So yeah, that whole abiding and doing things God's way, I would just I that's one of the big things that people discover is, there is a way to do business that honors God, and there's a way to do business that does not. And if you're a Christian, you need to take the time to learn how to do it in a way that honors God.
mm. That is so good, and that story is so helpful, and just for all of us to remember who we're meeting with. This is the
Yeah.
creator of the universe who is keeping our heart beating right now as we wonder if we have time. Oh, that's such a good example. I think a challenge of this is I love you use the word marinated. We're just marinating in the world's way of doing things, and I think it's so what you shared is so countercultural. I
Yeah.
mean, any message from you need more sleep to, get up, get early and get at those emails and, get ahead of things, get ahead of your people. And how how can we kind of train ourselves to even detect, man, I'm really being led by the world and the culture, even in our decision making. What advice do you have on how to evaluate our own decision making, even those micro decisions we don't even know that we're making?
Yeah, I just know and I was there, I used to run a seminary for 13 years and, uh, a lot of responsibility, everybody looking to the president, for making decisions and you just it's like a treadmill that you get on, and you walk in the door and you're just inundated. I mean, you walk in the door and the receptionist is saying, "Oh, Dr. Blackby, we needed you to do this, or they left these documents for you to sign, and you have there's someone here who wants to see you." And you walk in the door and you're just swept up into the everyone else's agenda and what everyone else needs from you. And you wanna be Superman or Superwoman that just can get everything done, and you at the end of the day, you're kinda walking out the door exhausted, you've been going hard all day, and so when you think to yourself, "How do I add anything more to my day? Like, how do I give God 2 extra hours at the start of this day when I'm already completely depleted, and it's exhausting, the work I do." But what I found is if you will let God especially if you can I really highly recommend you let God start the day off. I know people that try to end the day with God. I think it's far better to start the day with God. Um, a couple especially if you're in management or you're the CEO, if you're a leader, you tend to have a lot more discretionary time than you realize, and one of the things I think you'll realize if you'll start your day with God is that you don't have to be the servant of everyone else's agenda and everyone else's emergency and crisis. God helps you to become proactive, where God helps you right off the bat know what really matters today, what must be done. I love the phrase Paul used, "This one thing I do." And I've
Mm,
often thought to myself, like, I'm a kinda guy who loves to check boxes, and, I got 2 dozen things done today. I love knocking stuff off, but I realize a lot of those things I got done today, I could have done them a month from now, and it still would have been okay. It wasn't
mm.
crucial, but in most days, there's probably 1 or 2 things, if I just got those things done and done well today, it was a good day. But a lot of times I'm so busy chasing after stuff that's not crucial that I don't get to the really important things, or I don't do them as well as I could have. And that's what I find when I start out with God, He lets me know what is that one thing I must do, and I must do well. Or that maybe it's a lunch meeting with a vice president. I just need to spend some time with that person today, or leading a customer, a client. If I do nothing else but just spend time with that client today, it's been a very successful day. But, and so I find it very good for business. If you are just very harried and stressed and overwhelmed, I'm gonna guess you're not abiding because
Mm,
the God, of course, Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye who are weary, heavy laden, harried, stressed out. Come to me, because when you abide, when you walk in sync with me, you'll get all the important stuff done, but you also realize a bunch of stuff you didn't have to even do. It wasn't you didn't even have to stress out about that. But you chose to because you're trying to be all things to all people. Maybe you're a people pleaser, and walking with Christ sets you free from a lot of that, where now you're pleasing
mm,
one person, and that person loves you very much and wants the best for you, and you just please that person every day, and it's amazing how much less stress you experience in the process.
mhm. That's such a good reminder. If we're feeling anxious and harried on a regular basis, we're probably not abiding. And a topic we talk about a lot here is mission drift. You know, even those
Yeah,
indicators or those yellow or red flags in our own lives of personal drift. And I loved again when you wrote the forward for the book and you sent the initial draft and it opened with this passage from Judges 2, verse 7 and to 10. And I got goosebumps when I saw it because I use that verse often when we're talking to people about mission drift because we see how the Israelites drifted from one generation to the next in a matter of 3 verses in scripture. It
yeah,
happened so
yeah,
fast. The
yeah.
next generation came up and didn't know the works of the Lord that he had done for his people. And so I love what you just shared there because it's a great example of what individual drift can look like. And drift obviously happens corporately as well. I feel like you can be on different parts of the journey where you're figuring out how to integrate faith in the workplace. And then there's some places that have built up a really strong values driven culture that reflects biblical values and they're on the edge of a transition and they want to keep those values going. But so often organizations, those values get lost in a business sale or a transition. I'd love to hear from you. How have you seen mission drift? What has it looked like and how can we avoid it personally? How can we avoid it in our organizations as well?
Yeah, and it's you have a great work, great book, great focus that you do because drift is just a common human experience, in personally and corporately. So many organizations, churches, companies, they started out with great passion and great focus. We're going to, here's this church. It's a brand new subdivision in our city. We're going to put a church there, reach this subdivision. There's no other church here. All these new families moving in, a great vision, great passion. And 10 years later, you go visit that church, it's still there. They don't have one person from that community going to their church. Everybody's driving in from some other part of the city. It's like, well, that's great. You have a church, you have services, but that was the mission was to reach this community, and you're not reaching anybody here. You become a regional church to drive people drive for 30, 40 minutes to get here, but there's nothing going on here to reach the very community you felt that was your mission. How does that happen? And, it's you mentioned, judges, and it's interesting. You think about a person like Joshua or Moses, either one, they saw incredible miracles of God, great victories from God. I mean, just there's no question the power of God, and yet, like, how could you be Joshua's kid and then not walk with God yourself, not believe in God the same way. We never hear about Joshua's kids. Like Joshua famously at the end of the book says, you choose this day whom you're going to serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He said that, but we never hear from his kids. We don't know. There's no evidence that he ever was successful. He wanted that. He wanted his kids to follow God. There's no evidence that they did. Uh, and so a lot of people have that phrase on their walls of their house, but there's no evidence that he was successful. Maybe he was, we don't know. But But I'm thinking, how could you have a great man or woman of God as your parent and
Er,
then not have the same passion? But that's the dilemma. The human dilemma is every generation has got to buy in as well. And and what I've seen with organizations is the founder was very passionate. And maybe the people he worked with at the time knew the passion. They knew the vision, they knew the mission, and they were committed to it. But as that first generation passes from the scene, what happens in most organizations is a bureaucracy develops, and I'm just I know that bureaucracies can be necessary. I'm not a big fan of them though. And bureaucracies, they don't care so much about the mission anymore. They care about their budget, about their program, their turf, their silo. And now just don't infringe on that's my area. Don't get into my area. And we spend more time protecting our turf than we do pursuing the mission. And so it never takes long until all of a sudden you've got all these disparate groups not working together, not driven by a common mission. Now just don't, hey, don't take away any of my budget. We need all of our funds. I need my personnel. Don't go asking my staff to do stuff in your area. They belong to me. And then all of a sudden you've got uh, or along comes some new initiatives that we're going to start this over here and we're going to be in charge and we're going to do it. Well, it has nothing to do with the mission, but it's gonna make our department look really good. And the next thing it doesn't take long, and you're looking around saying, "What happened? There's just a mess over here." Like, if the founder were to come back today and look at what's going on, he'd be just sick to his stomach at how off it has gotten, but it's very common. It's very common for that to happen because, you can't just assume that because you were on Mount Sinai, you parted the Red Sea, that your son is gonna just say, "Hey, my dad parted the Red Sea. I'm always gonna trust God, do things his way." No, you could have had a giant of a founder, a giant of a CEO who mentored you, but the next generation, now it's your time to step up and pursue that same mission. And it's never an automatic, as you well know in your own studies.
mhm. Well, you kind of reference I think a lot of people know you from your current work leading Blackaby Ministries, but you were the head of seminary, you were a pastor, you held a lot of leadership roles as well, not just discipling leaders, but being that leader yourself and thinking about generational transitions and things like that. Share with us a little bit about when we think about abiding practices corporately, whether you're a nonprofit and what you can do from a business perspective. What are some of the ways that you as a leader have encouraged that in your organizations as a team or yeah, corporately? What do you recommend? What has that looked like in your leadership?
Yeah, and it is an ongoing challenge, and I'm kind of facing that now. I came into our ministry, my dad was the founder, he was still part of the ministry, but I became the president, and so the founder, the person everybody tells me is the greatest man of God they've ever known is, still around and still active, but I'm the one running things now. And now I've got a couple of my kids and a son-in-law that are VPs and in management working with me that I'm trying to position to take more and more responsibility in the future. And so I'm in between having received something and now trying to pass it on. And so I'm very much aware of that. And of course, much has been written on it, but a lot of that comes down to culture as well. It's not just what we do, but why do we do it that way? And I remember, especially my son-in-law, I was actually teaching at Oxford, England, and he was with me, and we were spending some time together. And some things happened while we were there, uh, where another person had just not performed well, and we're literally while I'm there, another person that's involved, is being uninvited to do some things. And, and now management the people responsible are coming to me to see if we could pick up some slack. they're trusting us and they're not trusting someone else. And so I've got my son-in-law with me, and I'm just trying to share that with him. And I'm saying, like, not we're not trying to be critical of anybody else, but but let me explain to you why we do things this way. And look at how people are responding. People trust us. People value what we provide. And let me tell you why they do. Let me tell you why we get asked back to do stuff a second and third and fourth time. Because there's certain things that are important to us that we do that a lot of other organizations don't. And so, it's never just what we do. It's you have to explain why we do it this way because if you don't understand the why, then the what will get changed all the time. And it doesn't mean you don't upgrade your methods, but there's just certain things that if you can help them really understand this is why no one else does it quite like this because we believe this, we value this, and it's tied to our values. It's tied to we believe God started our whole organization so that we could be able to provide this and address that. And that's what makes us distinctive. If we ever lose that, if we ever stop producing this and doing things this way, then we may not have any reason to still exist. And so and of course one of the big ways you do that in culture is you tell stories. And so it was interesting because that experience with my son-in-law, we were watching a story unfold right before our eyes. And so I was trying to kind of give commentary on this story to say, hey, listen, I just got asked this morning if I could fill in for this person because they don't want him to do this anymore because of the way
Mhm.
he's handling himself, because of the way that he's acting. And so we just got to make sure we never act that way. We never do
Right?
that. And so and that becomes kind of a storyline now in our management team to say, let's just always guard ourselves that we never slip into that kind of behavior, that kind of entitlement, that type of prideful behavior, whatever. And so, because if you can pass that on to the next generation where now they value, and it's fun for me when I hear my son-in-law, especially because I didn't raise my son-in-law like I did my son. And so, my son knows what I think a lot more because I raised him from birth, but son-in-laws have just been around the last little while. And so I just keep saying, "Hey, this may seem crazy to you, but let me tell you why we do it this way. There was this time. Let me tell you a story. Your all your culture should have a story attached to it somewhere, and so you just tell those stories. Then I'll hear my son-in-law telling those stories to people to explain to them why we do things this way, and you realize, okay, well, I'm feeling better about the future now because they get it, and they're telling the same stories now, and so hopefully they may not even remember all the specific teaching that I tried to give them on the subject, but they'll remember the story, and they'll remember we
Mhm.
don't wanna be like that. And so,
Right.
and there are certain stories that provide warnings, and then certain stories
Yes.
that provide inspiration. Yeah, this story reminds us, yeah, let's always be this kind of organization. This story, let's make sure we never slip into that behavior.
I love that. Well, I love and that's just a great example of discipleship or mentoring, whatever verb you wanna use, that next generation of leaders, just giving them a window into your brain, into the culture you're building, into the why. I think that's such helpful advice, and it doesn't take that much time. It's just one of those you're bringing people along, you're letting them observe with you, you're narrating the situation for them and giving them some context to help bring them into the culture, and then they can be the ambassadors or the champions of that culture and the mission that you're building.
Yeah. And don't assume that because people are watching what you're doing that they understand what you're doing. We oftentimes think, well, they were in this company for 10 years. They saw what we did. Yeah, but they never knew why you did it that way.
Mhm.
If they'd understood why you did it that way, they would begin to value what you were doing and how you were doing it. But all they saw is that's just Richard's style. That's just what Richard does. But if I become the CEO, I'm going to do it a different way. Well, if you knew why Richard did it that way, that might have saved you some frustration when you tried it a different way and you fell flat in your face. Richard knew that's what would happen. And so I find as a leader sometimes when you feel again the stress of getting a lot of things done, that you can just feel kind of frustrated. I don't have time to explain myself here. We need to get stuff done. Decisions need to get made. Sometimes that's true, but a lot of times you have more time than you realize, and you do have time to explain, or, narrate why. Keep letting people know the why. And if you bring them in on the why, you're going to be addressing culture then and values. And you're going to save the next generation from perhaps making some of the mistakes you had to make so that you learned the right way to do it. I've always said, the only thing better than learning from your own failures is learning from other people's failures. And so if you failed, save the next generation some of those experiences by helping them learn from yours and why it is you've come to value doing it this way.
So I love this. You've kind of shared about what's happening within your organization now and think about transitions and raising up the next generation. In in that context, I love to hear what does abiding look like for you personally, and what do you feel like God's teaching you in this season where you're really intentionally raising up the next generation of leadership?
Yeah, and I'm one that I need I need to be constantly reminded that there is a break in life. I know about the gas pedal. I press on it all the time, but I need abiding helps me remember that there's a break that sometimes I need to just slow down and one thing I learned from my dad was, I mean, my dad was a busy person, but my dad was an impactful person. You got around my dad. I can't tell you how many people have said to me that a 10-minute conversation they had with my dad changed their life. And I can't begin to tell you how many people have said that. That maybe they just were driving my dad to the airport and the conversation they had in the car going to the airport or picking him up at the airport, picking him up at his hotel to take him over to the conference center, and just a simple conversation that changed their life. And so one of the things God's had to impress upon me is if you want to be that kind of impactful person, you can't give to others what you don't have yourself. And so part of abiding is you're drawing as close to God as you can and letting God do a download on you and fill you up with truth, with the Spirit, with power, with love, with grace, with wisdom. And now that you're full, everybody you bump into all day long is gonna benefit because of that. And so I used to kinda measure, my success by how many boxes I could check in a day. How much work did I get done? How many tasks did I complete? And now I measure it more by what was the impact of what I did. If, I got a lot of unimpactful things done today, I'm not sure that I was all that successful. But what if I did fewer things, but some people's lives were forever changed today out of those few things I did? Maybe in the long run, that's a lot better. So that's part of what abiding has done for me is to say, if one life was forever changed because of their interaction with me today, if I do that 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, there's going to be a lot of significant change taking place over the course of a year of just me leading. And so going more for impact than just volume. Vol- the volume of not very impactful things is I just did a whole lot of stuff that didn't matter much. That's
Yeah.
not I'd rather do fewer things that people are still talking about 20 years later. And
Mhm.
so how do you live that way?
Mhm. Go for impact, not volume. It's so good. It's kind of like when you're working out, you can just do like a light whatever, or you can press into it and use that time, steward that time well to get a harder workout in and build more muscles and strength as you do it. It's a choice though.
Yeah. Yeah. And and I think especially in North America, we value busyness so much. We to us, we feel guilty if we're not busy, but so much of what makes us busy is not important. And so we're busy with unimportant things. And I would say I'd rather be less busy, but be managing the really crucial issues in my organization and my relationships and the things that will be lasting in impact. And so, yeah, busyness, you can go to the gym, be very busy doing nothing that ever stretches your muscles. You can be a flurry of activity and walk out having done no good really to your body. Or you can be very focused on fewer exercises, but you really stretch those muscles and you'll feel it the next day. But you're going to be stronger for it.
That's so good. So I love this legacy of impact, really going for impact, not volume. When you think out the next 10, 20, 50 years for Blackaby Ministries, what is your hope that what do you hope is still happening or happening at that far out in the future?
Yeah, well, a couple things. One is there's some distinctive things that we do, partly just from the message that my dad originally developed with experiencing God. A lot of times I'll be asked to speak at a conference somewhere, and they'll say, one way or another, they'll say, "Well, we just really wanted to have a Blackaby on the platform here because we know that if we have a Blackaby here, we'll be getting this kind of content, this kind of perspective, that God will be ministering in this way." And so we know that there's some distinctive perspectives that God has just granted us that we want to remain true to that. And so my prayer would be that long after I'm gone, we would still be known as you want a Black to be involved. You want to hear what they have to say because it'll be fresh and distinctive and God oriented, God focused. But so that would certainly be a hope that I would have, and that we would not just chase after being like everybody else. There's certainly a pressure in a lot of businesses. Well, what's everybody else doing? How do they do their marketing? How do they do their, HR, whatever it is? Let's just cut and paste and say, well, there's some principles that maybe are good overall to do, but to stay distinctive and to say that you could buy a car from lots of other places. Why would you buy a car from us? Well, because there's some distinctive things that we do in the way we treat you and service you after you buy the car that you won't get anywhere else. And I'd say we hold on to those distinctives, and that's especially when you go to the next generation. That's a real test if you can do that, or if every generation just starts to kind of flatten everything out to be just like everybody else.
Yeah. That is such a good word. I've been working on a white paper on drift in Christian higher education, and what you
Mm.
just shared there is the punchline of it. It is those organizations, those universities and Christian schools that are leaning into their distinctive identity as wanting to be a faith-saturated learning environment, committed to excellence. You see those flourishing and others that are veering toward those, what I call the plain vanilla values.
Yeah,
Those are a lot of the ones that are being challenged because they're no longer distinctive. They may not, offend anyone, but they're not distinctive either.
yeah. It's
So,
funny. When I was a seminary president, one of the things that gets you is all the accrediting agencies because they have all these standards and they come in and they give you their perspective on what you should be doing because that's across the board what schools like yours does. And I remember we were coming up to be reaccredited. I think it was like 10-year thing. And so a committee comes in and we were in Canada, so they wanted to have at least one or two Canadians on the committee. But so the only Canadian they could get was from a school that was very, very liberal. I mean, theologically, they were like light years away from our school. But so they're going to come in and tell us how to train ministers. And they're a denomination that's hemorrhaging people just in free fall decline because of some stances they've taken and the way they're operating. And so, so they looked over all our numbers, and we were trying to develop pastors and particularly church planters. So we over 85% of all of our students were actively involved in a church practicing what they were learning in the classroom. And we wanted it to be 100%. We felt bad it was only 85%, but because we just thought we come into the classroom, learn, and then get out there and practice it, and then come back to the classroom and ask questions. But this guy, but when they finally sat down with the president to give the preliminary report, this one guy, the Canadian guy, said, one concern I have is," and he pointed out the 85%. He said, I they if they're gonna be this busy in church, they're not gonna have time to be reading. They need to learn that while they're in school, they need to read and study and go to seminars, and you just ask too much of them to be that hands-on all the time while they're in school. And so I looked at the whole committee sitting around my table in my office and said, "Well, I'm just gonna have to fundamentally disagree with you on that one." I said, "Because if we're not training people to be scholars, we're training people to be pastors. So we're not training them to be book readers. We're training them to be leaders. And to be a leader, you don't read about it in books. You get out there and you practice it." And so I said, "So I will make note of your objection, and we're going to carry on." We actually take pride in standing out as a school that does things differently. It's not just about an academic exercise. We felt the pressure, and of course your
Yeah.
accreditation's on the line. If they I had to try to smile and be nice about it, because if I got into a power struggle, we could lose our accreditation, which really affects school. So I mean, and that's just an example in higher education, but in business as well, there's going to be certain pressures, government pressures, regulations, just the way software is done, all kinds of stuff where it just sort of corrals you and herds you into doing it just the way everybody else does it.
Mm.
And you go to a lot of conferences, and they always bring in whoever's company is doing great right now, and they tell you their secrets. If you just run your business like we run our business, then you'll have record sales as well. And so much of what those conferences become is just, let's just copy the latest thing that's working. And so we
Right.
just chase after the success. And before you know it, you look just like everybody else. You're not, whatever mission God had for you that was distinctive when you started your organization, you've long since jettisoned that, and now you're just chasing after the latest fad as well. And then you don't stand out anymore. You're not
Mhm.
distinctive. You could shut down your doors today, and you've got 10 other competitors who do the same thing that you're doing, maybe even better. And so you've lost your purpose. You've lost your way.
Mhm. Yeah, the term I came across was mimetic isomorphism, which is just a mouthful to say, but it's like you just start becoming like other people. You're not clear on who you wanna be, so you just look to others for direction. And you can see how that directly influences is it kind of our is our antennae toward our peers, or is it toward God? Are we abiding, or are we being driven by the current, the stream that we're in and our peers around us?
Yeah. And I've had to say sometimes to organizations, because a lot of times organizations are driven more by preserving their existence.
Mm,
We want to exist. And I would say, but if you've lost your mission, maybe you
yeah,
don't need to exist.
right.
Once you've forsaken your mission, why do you exist? Just so people can stay employed, so you can still make a profit. But if your mission is simply to just keep surviving, that's not a great mission. That's not very compelling. That doesn't typically attract top level talent to help you continue to exist for another decade. And so, but that's often what happens. It's like, well, yeah, we were founded to do this, but that doesn't really sell well, or donors don't like to donate to that, or we can't get government funding if that's what we do, and so, let's do this. It's like, well, yeah, but if you forsake your mission, then why you don't necessarily need to exist anymore. But a lot of times that's really what drives it is what will help us exist, pay the bills, uh, carry on for another year, meet
Mhm.
payroll.
Right.
Well, that's not a compelling mission, meeting payroll.
Right. And even if it's the unstated motivation, like, of course, that's not gonna be written in the mission statement, but that for me to be a successful college president, university president, I just need to keep the doors open till I
Yeah,
can hand this off to somebody else. It's yeah,
yeah.
I that was a theme too, where people like, what does, faithful closure look like? Like, we remained faithful and we closed versus, we watered it down and ended up failing anyway as we became like other people. There's a difference there.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, if you look back even at like Harvard or something, and not that you don't develop other purposes over time, but their purpose was basically to train pastors and
Right.
to provide leaders for churches. And that's long since not been what they do, but that's why they were founded.
Mhm.
Harvard, the name Harvard was named after a pastor that was committed to having more pastors trained for New England, and so but, if you want donors, donors they won't give money to our mission, but they'll give money for this program. They'll give money so that we can name this department after them, and so, Boitea schools have all kinds of buildings and programs because a donor gave money for it that has nothing to do with their mission. The mission itself, nobody wanted to donate to that, so that's floundering and dying and shriveling up, but we've got all these other subsidiary, programs that are well funded because donors like that, and as someone that's had to work with donors for a long time, that can be really hard. I've literally had to come back to people that were prepared to give, money and say, "Listen, I'm so grateful that you'd wanna give money to our school, but that's what you wanna donate to is not something that's part of our mission. Would you consider giving to this? This would really help us with what God's called us to do," but that actually is not a priority to us at all. That's hard for, you're because you're as a president, you're gonna give an account for how much money did you raise this year, and you don't wanna turn away donations, you don't wanna turn away lots of money, and so there's just so many pressures to kind of follow the money, follow what the people are excited about, what the fad is. We can say we offer this same it's funny, some schools come up with a popular new program, and then all of a sudden all kinds of schools are doing the same thing and offering their version, and it's like, well, does that have anything to do with your mission, or is that just a hot button right now that people will donate money toward?
Yeah. It's the influence of donors is quite profound. You definitely see that
Yeah,
across the history of higher education in very significant ways how in just a matter of years, schools will cut their ties to churches, things like that, to, get a new funding source, and I think one of the things you just hit on was, a measure of a president's success is how much money they raise, for example, and I think our success measures are really something we need to evaluate carefully because if they are imbalanced or if they are swayed so heavily toward one thing, you can be sure that most leaders will move to that thing that boards are telling them is the most important thing.
yeah, and, sometimes, like, student count, body count,
Mhm.
of course, it's great to have lots of students if they're paying tuition, that's helping create revenue. But one of the things we had to look at when I was leading a school was, but what kind of bodies are coming in the door here? Like our churches need pastors, pastors who can go into hard places and turn churches around, start churches from granite, and we've got people that want to be a counselor one day, or they just want to study, but they want to be an academic. But but they're not necessarily gonna help the church any. In fact, they can't even teach a they tried to teach a Sunday school class in their local church, and it died, so that you wouldn't even have them teach a Sunday school class, but our churches are investing in this seminary so we produce pastors, and so, you know, you could say, "Well, numbers are up." Well, good, but let's dig into those numbers. Numbers of what? A bunch of students that will never be able to help the church? If this is if it's a denominational school or the mission of your school is to produce church leaders or things like that, then I would dig down to say, and 5, 10 years after they graduate, how many of them are actually leading in the church somewhere? And if not, yeah, you're measuring numbers, but you should be measuring successful leaders in the churches. Let's measure the thing we're trying to produce here. And what is our mission is to produce this, so let's measure that. But it's easy, especially, and I know if you're president of a school, you want to find numbers that are up, and then you want to measure that because then that makes you look good. But
Mhm.
your organization may be failing while you're getting top grades because you raised a lot of money or you have lots of students.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I have a lot of concern for boards of these institutions of higher education. I'm like, if they're governing from too much of a distance and they're seeing whatever numbers are being shown to them, they may not be picking up on some of that unhealth that you're highlighting. And so I think,
Yeah.
goodness, how can we build stronger boards to better steward this incredible opportunity that schools have to raise up the next generation of pastors, of leaders? How are we really stewarding that and making sure that, yeah, our measures of success and what the board's holding leadership accountable to is in fact aligned with that mission and that bigger outcome?
And you know what I found, and it's a reality of a lot of schools, but there's lots of schools that if you look at their mission, they'll talk about raising up leaders of some sort,
Yeah.
leaders in
Mhm.
government, leaders in culture, society, church. Um, but the problem is that faculties are made up primarily of non-leaders. So
Mhm.
their faculties consist of academicians. They're good at reading books, writing books, giving talks, giving lectures, but sometimes you'd be hard pressed to find that they've led anything successfully. And so I know when I came to be the seminary president, I think they had quality because we're trying to train pastors, and so they had said "Y- to be a professor, you have to have been a pastor for at least 5 years. It seems crazy. Like there's probably few industries if you're training people to be a doctor and you've never been a doctor yourself, or
Right.
you know to be a flight to be a airline pilot, but you've never flown a plane, but you're going to teach them how to fly a plane, like it doesn't make sense. But when it comes to leaders, when it comes to pastors, you've got lots of professors teaching people to be pastors who've never been a pastor. And so my school at least said you had to have been one for 5 years. But while I was there, I tweaked that up. I said, you know, because I literally knew people that wanted to be a professor at a seminary, and so they would just go find some little tiny country church, and they would keep it at just about death's door, but they'd put their 5 years in, and hope the church didn't die on their watch, and then they could qualify to be a professor now. And of course, the old adage is those who can do and those who can't teach, right?
Yes.
And so I so I changed it to say no, 5 years of successful pastoral leadership. Did your
Yeah.
church grow? Why, if you can't grow a church in 5 years, why are you teaching? We don't want you teaching other people
Yeah.
because you clearly don't. If you don't know how to lead in such a way that your organization grows, why would we have you teach other people how to lead that way? And so that is one of the great dilemmas for schools is that we have a mission, you know, and often it involves to train leaders, but then you look at the teachers and they're not leaders. And so
Mhm.
we teach them theories about leadership, but we don't teach them how to lead. And some of that's inherent with just an academic kind of based uh, training program. But I think if I'm serving on a board, especially of a school, I'm gonna have that mission statement in front of me, and I'm gonna use that as a grid. Every time that they talk about building another building, endowing another chair, whatever it might be, I'm gonna be asking, "And how does that help us achieve this mission?"
Mhm.
You wanna hire this professor because he's written 3 like, I literally when I was the president, I there was a guy, we wanted to hire a church planting professor to teach a whole program of to teach people how to be church planters, and we had a guy apply, came by my office, and he had developed a whole software program for church planters, and he had read all the books, knew all the people, but I asked the obvious question, "Have you planted a church?" "Well, no, I haven't." Do you
Right.
go to a church plant?" "No, I don't." I said, "Why then then I cannot hire you to teach people to do something that you've never done yourself." It's something that's that hands-on as church planting. I mean, you could teach Greek and maybe never have lived in Greece, but you could study the Greek language, but to teach church planting, you have to have done it, and so I just couldn't hire him, but there's lots of schools that will, and he did get hired by another school in the area to teach something he'd never done, but I would and so there's always that tension when you're trying to whatever whatever organization you have is, can this person actually help us achieve our mission? And what
Mhm.
they might
Mhm.
believe in the mission, they might be able to talk about the mission, but can they do it? Can they teach others to do it? And if not, nice person, but maybe not qualified.
Right. Yeah, one of the questions I encourage, whether you're bringing on like a new board member or a new leader, is will this person help us advance the mission better than we do today? Are they bringing something to the table that will help us do this at a higher level or a better level? And usually I'm concerned about, hiring those passive or bringing on those passive acceptors who are like, "Oh yeah, the mission's great and we'll sign the statement of faith," but they won't defend it when it becomes unpopular.
Yeah.
And so but I love what you're saying about even just the credentialing. We can be so blinded by these credentials over here that we're not getting down to the brass tacks of like, well, do you have the experience doing? And can you lead other people to do something that you have done firsthand?
Yeah. And so you're being driven by your accrediting agency rather than your mission.
Yeah.
And as long as we please that, and I'll tell you, if you've ever been a part of higher education, every time you have to come up to be reaccredited, renew that. Tons of I mean, whole forests get lost in all the papers that have to be turned in, reports. The poor faculty, you wear them out, all the committee work and so on, and it's so tedious that you're just so focused on just getting them to sign off that without even realizing it, you're driven more by the accreditors than the mission. Because the mission is always assumed because you don't have to write a report. You don't have the mission coming in and holding you accountable, but the accrediting agency will. They'll come and give you their report, so you focus on them. And sadly, that in most accrediting agencies, of course, they're broad, interdenominational. They don't have a lot of beliefs like you do. They may not even believe in God, but you got to please them, or you're not accredited. It's, that's always been a bane of a lot of school administrators is we wanna be accredited, but it creates a constant pull, and challenge to tell us to do things in a way that's academically respectable. It's just not nearly as effective in getting things done the way our mission calls for it to be done.
Right. Yeah, there was a case in Pennsylvania with Cairn University, and to graduate licensed social workers, you need to have the accreditation from this agency. And the agency came in and made recommendations. And after 50 years of offering their social work degree, they decided to close it about 5 years ago because they said, we can't like, it is untenable what you're asking us to do. It's not aligned with our mission. So they ended up closing their social work program exactly because of what you said, because the accreditors wanted them to do something they felt like they couldn't do. And their
Hmm.
board decided if we can't do this and we need this accreditation to get licensed graduates, then we can't offer this program, which is so like seems like a small death sentence in higher ed where you don't want to be cutting programs, especially in
Yeah,
much needed fields like social work. You want to be able
yeah,
to teach them and teach them from your faith foundations.
yeah. And well, good for them for not compromising. But yeah, I know in Canada it's even worse. And one of the largest Christian universities for a while there, they fought all kinds of legal battles because the legal profession wouldn't recognize their attorneys that they were training in law school because to be a student there, you had to sign off on Christian values and Christian perspectives, and for non-Christians, they called that bigotry, that viewed things the way the Bible did. And so their school teachers they were training weren't going to get accredited. And so it's like unless you can just water down your ethical stance, of course, all the way through the school, they said, we're not condemning people. We're not putting them down. We're not being assaulting people we disagree with. We just have these standards, and but it gets really hard, and there's lots of accrediting agencies, and there's governmental boards and other standards out there as well for companies that uh, are going to make it harder and harder. I think there was a lot of issues coming up with even things like just men's and women's bathrooms in company offices, and what do you do with that? And lots of issues will come around and trends where if you're trying to honor God with your company, do things God's way, it won't necessarily be popular, and you'll feel lots of pressure to just kinda go along with how things are being done, and sometimes you may just feel like we'd be asked to compromise too much to do that.
Right. You just need to have that stake in the ground and defend it. And it's not easy though. And it becomes unpopular. I think that goes back to what you're saying about abiding. We need to be looking to God for direction on this
Yeah.
because you're called to put a stake in the ground, that's not what the culture is going to tell. Culture's not telling you to do that.
No, and that's where I think and you make such a contribution with just the whole mission aspect to say, it does this I mean, there's some things that maybe doesn't really matter, and
Yeah.
so if it
Right.
doesn't affect your mission, your values, okay, well, you know what? Okay, we'll do it that way. It doesn't really make a difference. But then there's other things that really does make a difference. And
Yeah.
that's where I think you have to that's why you need to know your mission and your values and say, because we know where the line is, where we can't cross this line. We've just forsaken our mission. We've just forsaken our values at this point. But this over here doesn't affect it at all. So who cares if this is easier? Then let's do that. But that's where you have to be really clear on the things that really matter.
You got to be clear. You got to build alignment. And I'd love to circle back to something you kind of hit on in a couple of the points that we talked about today, which is family and family mission, family alignment, generations, continuing to abide. And my husband and I both remember talking about this last night when we first met you and your colleague Rick at this YPO event and saw you alone at a table at a meal. We're like, we're going to go sit with them. And we actually asked you all for parenting advice because we've got three kids, we're younger than. And the theme that he and I both remember so clearly from both of you was just joy, cultivating joy in your families. It's not all about like, we don't do this, we don't want to drift from this, we don't want to. It's what are we drawing people to and cultivating in our families and in our family culture. And so I just want to open up to you, like, share with us what does it look like to cultivate joy in the context of your family?
Yeah, it's funny. At one point we had all three of our kids were teenagers, Of course, a lot of Christian families, Christian parents, they dread those years because these are the years where we've dragged them to church for years as kids, told them they can't do certain things, that they must do these things. But now they're 16, 17, they're going to push back and they might rebel. And so and so, unfortunately, I mean, teenage years can be very tumultuous for lots of reasons, but I think a lot of times we have a mindset where we just anticipate rebellion. It's almost self-fulfilling prophecy almost, but, so some families just decide, well, let's just surround our kids with so many rules and curfews and regulations that they don't have any room to rebel. We'll just be all over them and, because 'cause we're so afraid that the world's gonna come and tug them away and Satan will deceive them and get them into all kinds of trouble, and so we're just trying to protect them with as many rules as we can, but I just realized as my wife and I talked about that, we thought, there just aren't enough rules you can come up with that will make your kids love Jesus, or love
Yeah,
you. Like, you can't just
yeah,
make a rule about that. So, what what in fact, rules tend to do the opposite. They tend to drive people away. If that's a lot of kids have said, to me, Christianity was just a bunch of rules about what we weren't allowed to do. So who wants that? And so we thought, well, what can we do that will make our kids want to embrace our faith? Will cherish the home life that they had, their family that they had. And we really felt like it would be that there was joy in the home, that Christianity was associated not with rules, but with joy. You can rebel, yeah, if you have I mean, Adam and Eve had one rule in the entire paradise, and they rebelled against it. The
yeah,
moment you have even one rule, you now have an opportunity to rebel. But how do you rebel against joy? How do you just put your foot down and say, "There is way too much joy in this family. I'm just not gonna have any more of it." You're not gonna do that, right? So, just base your what you do on joy. Don't raise your kids to say, "Okay, we're Christians, so we don't dance, we don't play cards, we don't go to movie," whatever it is you don't do. And you don't want your kids associating being a Christian with all the stuff they can't do. We
yeah.
wanted our kids to realize because we're Christians, look at all the stuff we get to do. Look at all the
Mhm.
benefits that come because we are part of a church family and we do things God's way and God's a priority and God blesses our family and God answers our prayers and so we really tried to focus on that and to make sure that we as a family we never went that far without there being laughter. I know a lot because a lot of people will look at our family and like my dad had 5 kids. All 5 kids are in full-time Christian ministry. Uh, all 3 of my kids are in Christian ministry. They look at the generations and say, "They're not just Christians. They don't just go to church. They're Christian leaders." How do you just have generation after generation that does that? And they assume, well, did you have like 3-hour Bible studies every night before you put the kids to bed? Or what did you do? Like, did you just learn the Hebrew and Greek language when they were in preschool? Like, um, no, like it was just fun to be a Christian.
Yeah,
It was fun to be in a Christian family. We never bemoaned the fact that there were certain things we didn't do. We thought it was really cool that we got to be in a Christian home like we were in. That's what we try to do with our family. There were things that they weren't allowed to do. Uh, like in our family, just the party scene. You don't wanna be chasing after all the parties at school. You don't wanna get in that trap of, are you in and the cool kids that go to get invited to these drunken fest parties, uh, or do just don't go down that road because it just doesn't end well. But but you're not gonna miss out on anything. 'Cause you're
yeah,
gonna have way more fun than they are. You look at some of your friends getting over their hangover the next day, and they're gonna tell you what a great party it was. They threw up all night and, crashed their dad's car trying to drive home that night. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun to me, how about if we do this as a family? Why don't we do this and let's go have fun doing that, and so all what's interesting is now my kids are all parents themselves, and every one of them has said, "We're gonna have the same rules." Like, we weren't hurt in the slightest by, the family rules, the culture of our family. In fact, that's what we really hope our family it was fun. About 2 years ago, my oldest son, his family was gonna go to Disney World, and, they'd booked all their flights and hotels and had everything all planned. And then they just reached out to us and said, "We would just love it if you guys could come join us and just hang out with us. This is like a dream of our families to do this, and we're gonna live the dream." But when we got there, my oldest son said, "Dad, and I want you to come with me and our 2 oldest boys." We kinda divided up. The women went with the 2 younger ones a lot of the time, and the dads went with the to do the bigger rides with the bigger kids. And
Uh-huh.
my son said, "But I remember when I was my kid's age and you took me, and how much fun it was doing theme parks with you." And he mentions specific rides and says, "And I want my kids to go on the same ride you took me on, and I want you to be there so that they can have the same experience I had when I went on that ride with you." And I mean, I'm
What?
all getting choked up and thinking, "You even remember? Back when
Yeah.
at that time," he said, Dad, that I have so many incredible memories of all the fun we had growing up, and I want my kids to have those same memories." And I thought, wow, like I mean, that son is also a church planter, a pastor, has a PhD in apologetics, so he didn't just get the fluff.
Yeah.
He's a pastor today. Like, he loves Jesus because following Jesus was the most joyful thing he's ever done, and he wants his family now to have the same experience. So, yeah, so there's lots of important things, but joy. Some Christian families, they try to help their kids be Christian by all the rules, by the discipline, by all the negative stuff they're not allowed to do. And I just think there's a much better way, a much more positive way. It doesn't mean you countenance sinful behavior, but
Mhm.
you promote and you celebrate all the good stuff that comes with being a Christian instead of constantly, if you just tell your kids all the time, "I don't want any of you smoking a cigarette," or whatever. "I don't want any of you doing drugs." Well, after a while, your kids are going to ask, "Well, what's the big deal about drugs? Maybe we should check it out."
Yeah.
But instead, if you're saying, "Why would you wanna do drugs when you could get a much better high by hanging out with your family and doing this and having a party with your family?" So you put it in better perspective than just don't do that. Instead, it's like, "No, I'm gonna give you a much better alternative here." And, so, you can't outcompete with the world in terms of just party, but there's a lot of joy. You can compete with the world when it comes to joy,
Yeah.
because joy comes from God, and you can chase after cheap, temporary happiness, but fill your home with joy, and that's something that the world can't compete with you on.
Mhm. That's so good. And actually reminds me of something you shared earlier on the business context where you explain the why. So, here's how we do things for our company culture, for our family culture too. Well, here's why. Like, I know I've talked to my kids. I remember my mom telling me it's like God's 10 commandments are like an umbrella of protection. It's not because he doesn't want you to have fun. It is an umbrella of protection. And he gives it is a gift. It is actually to our benefit. And there's freedom within that, but it's to our benefit. And so I think
Yeah,
explaining the why, even to our kids, of, well, how do you think that will play out? Let's just
yeah. Well,
talk it
it's like and I mean, there's a fine line, but, like, when my kids were teenagers, they had a really close friend that, went to a party, got drunk, totaled his dad's car out trying to get home, got arrested, got a record, lost his license, was in huge debt, had to pay his parents off for years, for the damage they did to his car. Um, and we're like, let's unpack that. Okay, like they don't show you this on the beer commercials.
Yeah.
Now you've just totaled out your dad's car and you lost your license. Now you got to walk everywhere, ride your bike. I said, like, do you understand when you're getting invited to come to some party and they're all going to get drunk? Like, do you understand that look at that. Take a really good look at that. Or look at that 14-year-old girl that's now pregnant and is going to have to drop out of high school and raise a child. And the father took off and is gone. And now, and like, okay, that's that's why we tell you what we're trying to teach you. And it's not that we're trying to be legalistic, we're not trying to judge other people. We're just saying we're trying to protect you from some of this so that you get all the joy and you have an abundant, full, happy, joyful life. And so yeah, we would provide that commentary along the way to just say, um, and we weren't just trying to criticize their friends, but we're just saying, but be wise. Like, there's a lot of other people's mistakes that you can learn from so that you don't make the same mistake. So they've already made the mistake. So let's learn from that. So you don't have to, some people always have to learn the hard way. And until they made the mistake themselves, it doesn't connect for them. But we would say the really smart people learn from other people's mistakes. So you guys are smart. Let's see what we can learn. And, yeah, I tell you, I've led lots of things over the years. Nothing, has been as challenging as a leader than leading in the home and trying to help your kids make wise decisions that honor God and that, gives them a sense of freedom. You didn't just tell them what to do, but then you also didn't let them just make disastrous choices that they'd have to live with the rest of their life as well. There's this fine balance all the time, trying to help them grow and mature, and yet protecting them from just so many dangers out there today.
Right. That's so true. This has been so good. I have learned so much, as I always do when we talk.
Uh,
I think about, like, okay, what are my action items coming out of this? How do I carve out more time for unhurried time with God? That I think is one of my takeaways, and
uh,
continue to think about how to creatively brainstorm with my husband. How do we cultivate joy in the context of, yeah, guardrails of protection around our kids, but really drawing them toward joy and that abundant life in Christ. I would just love to close our time with parting words of advice that you have for younger leaders who really aspire to live out their faith in their families, in their leadership, in their workplaces. What advice would you give to them?
yeah, I think, just spend regular time, if you can, in the morning, and just put all those things that really are dear and near to you, your kids, your marriage, your career, whatever responsibilities as they're unfolding for you as you're maybe starting out in your career. Uh, I've known lots of people, like I've worked with lots of guys in their 60s who are just now figuring out that family is really important, or that their walk with God's really important, and they'd love to go back to when they were 20 and take another run at it. And so I always just say, don't be one of those guys that at 60 you finally figured out what matters. You're on your third marriage, that your kids don't want to talk to you, they don't invite you over for Christmas, and now it's like, okay, now I'm starting to figure this out. I'd say better to figure it all out early on at the outset, so you don't have regrets later. And so the best way to do that is just let God help you understand what matters and what doesn't. And sometimes when you think it really matters that you always please your boss, you always please your biggest customer, that you make it to the top of the ladder before your colleague does, who's on the same trajectory, wanting that VP chair before you get it, uh, and he's willing to sell out more than you are. Just 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 learn early what really matters, what doesn't matter, that you have probably more time, that you may feel the pressure to compromise, but you've got more, say, perhaps, than you think. You have more choice than you might realize, and so just take the time, to make wise choices early on so you don't have to repair a lot of damage later. Just, a great life is just a series of wise choices just made in a row, just one after the next. And so, just keep making wise choices, and there's like compound interest on a wise choice. As time goes on, it just bears more and more fruit and return. And so, especially if you're younger and you've got lots of, runway ahead of you still, now's the time to start making those wise choices and take the time to find out what God's will is and then do it. As crazy as it might seem, as crazy as the world might tell you it was. And over time, you'll look back and you'll realize that, thank you, God, you were guiding me the whole way. And look at this amazing life that you've given me as a result.
Mm. Ah, well, thank you for sharing that wisdom. It's been a blessing to me, and I know it will bless others too. Thank you so much for joining us today and just sharing so openly about your life and work and what God's been teaching you along the journey. We're really, really grateful.
Thanks. It was fun being with you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope this was helpful in your leadership journey. On behalf of On Mission Advisors, if there's anything we can do to help you better define, protect, and champion what matters most in your company, please reach out and contact us. We'd be happy to help you as well. Until next time.